Rodafleming here in the somewhat rainy Philippines. I'm going to make a video today, and today's video is called The Myth of Internalized Homophobia and Transsexuals. Okay? Before I get into that, I just want to say a few things. I've had immense problems with my web hosting, which has taken me so far weeks to resolve. It's put me back on everything. I have to basically rebuild my rodafleming.com site. Fortunately, the other sites that I'm working on are not so badly affected, and the All About HSTS one will not be harmed at all, although I will have to relocate the hosting elsewhere because I was failed terribly by the company I was with, which is called TSO Host, and don't go there. Anyway, the myth of internalized homophobia. Well, first of all, what on earth is internalized homophobia? And for that, I'm going to refer to an article called Do I Sound Gay? Gay Men and Internalized Homophobia, which is published by Springer in July 2015. And it's a very interesting article, and I'm going to take a few things out of it. It says, we believe that internalized homophobia is why a gay man would dislike sounding feminine. Internalized homophobia is why a gay man would dislike sounding gay. We believe internalized homophobia is why sounding less like a man would make a gay man view himself as inferior. Okay? According to research, people developed internalized homophobia because they learned that being different or gender non-conforming was bad from their families, friends, society, etc. And so they also learned not to love themselves. So being stressed out and psychologically bothered by, quote, sounding gay, to the point that one's self-esteem and other parts of one's life are negatively affected, is a very telling symptom of internalized homophobia. Now he then goes on to discuss a movie, discusses the words of one of the authors, subjects of this movie, who again felt himself ostracized because he had very markedly flamboyant gay mannerisms and a gay voice. And I quote, pretty much everything that is gay. Now, this means that internalized homophobia in men essentially is the fear or dislike of appearing to be feminine. Okay? Which you need to think about that a minute. It's the fear or dislike of appearing to be feminine. Now, when did this become a part of gay culture? And to do that, a good author that you should read is Quentin Crisp, who published a number of books, the most famous of which is called The Naked Civil Servant. And in this he describes the life of an openly homosexual man living and working in London prior to World War II, during and after. And his description, it's a very funny book, he's a very witty writer, and he describes in detail his life and his sexual experiences as a homosexual man. Now, for Quentin Crisp, a homosexual man was exactly this: a male who was attracted to masculine men and who was a recipient sexual partner. In other words, he never penetrated, he only was ever penetrated. And he thought, it's very clear from his writing, that this was what a homosexual was. A homosexual male was a male who was attracted to men and who wanted to play the role of woman with men. Never saw himself as being a part of a movement or a club. In his books he describes how the community, the sort of loose community that he was part of, tended to meet in a number of particular pubs, and this sort of moved over the years. And here you would find what he called homosexuals, which were the receptive gay males, who were very feminine, very effeminate, you might like to call them, and where masculine men would go cruising to find these people, to basically have sex with them. And he describes these encounters in detail. So, Quentin Crisp was beaten up, and he describes this. He was ostracized, and he describes this. But the one thing he wasn't was afraid to be what he was. He was quite happy that he was extremely feminine. He actually says at one point that he tried dressing as a woman, but he said it didn't really work because in a strange way it made him look more masculine. So he adopted what might today be called an intermediate, perhaps a non-binary appearance, where he looked extremely feminine, but he was wearing male clothes. In particular, he describes always fitting his feet into shoes 2 sizes too small for him, which seems like a very painful way of expressing your femininity, but never mind. What he wasn't, or what he didn't have, was internalized homophobia. He absolutely embraced his homosexuality. That's what he was, and he recognized it. He didn't see it as a problem. He didn't see himself as part of a movement or anything. He just saw it as being what he was. So when did gay men start exhibiting internalized homophobia? Well, the answer to that is after the war. Now, what happened at the end of World War II was that unprecedented numbers of men had been mobilized into the US Armed Forces to fight in Europe and also in the Far East, in the Pacific Theatre. And these contained a significant number of homosexuals, homosexual males, okay, who had, in one way, probably enjoyed their time in the armed forces, but at the same time had been highly victimized during it. Most of these were demobilized either in New York or on the West Coast in California. In California, there was a man called Harry Hay. Harry Hay was a communist, a member of the Communist Party. He was actually married, but we know that this marriage was never consummated. It was a marriage of convenience, and it existed because at that time the Communist Party was very, very hostile towards homosexuals. Really didn't want to be associated with them. He was obviously both a communist and homosexual, so in order to move freely within the party, he got married. Divorced after 2 years. It didn't come to anything. After the war, he was still an activist. He thought that the one thing that he could do was to form an activist organisation of gays. And this was called the Mattachine Society. The original Mattachine Society was a French comedy troupe, political satirists, basically, similar to the Commedia dell'arte, even Punch and Judy. And this was very much what he intended, that this would be a campaigning group, polemical, very keen to satirize the authorities, but also with the underpinning of his Marxist ideas. Well, this was the height of McCarthyism, and what happened was that in 1953 the group was exposed in a major newspaper article for its communist roots. There was an emergency meeting of the group, and at this point it was taken over by conservatives, and the left-wingers were basically all thrown out, including Hay, from their positions of authority anyway. This changed things enormously, and the new theme was that the Mattachine would not be a strident, campaigning, flamboyant gay group. I mean, Harry Hay himself was a homosexual cross-dresser, a very, very flamboyant gay. What it would now strive to do was to assimilate. And the idea was it would become what's called accommodationist, that it would be, that it would see gay men accommodated within mainstream society, that they would assimilate. And they would do this by not appearing to be gay. This was the essential underpinning desire and principle of the Mattachine from 1954 onwards. Now, there was, by the way, a parallel female organisation called the Sisters of Bilitis, but we're not going to discuss these just now, or that just now. We'll come back to another time. The Mattachine's adoption of accommodationist principles of desire to assimilate meant, as I've said, that appearing to be feminine for a male had to be suppressed. Because that's how gays were being identified. It's how gays have always been identified. They're feminine, right? The new group who had taken over the Mattachine wanted to suppress the femininity. They wanted them to appear to be ordinary men just like every other man, except we love each other. And they decided that the way that they would progress the case of gay men generally was to, rather than engaging in street protest and that sort of thing, was to try to persuade people like psychiatrists, academics and politicians of the rightness of their case. And okay, in the first two, they found themselves on fertile ground, and eventually the politicians came into line also, and the effect of this was the slow advancement of homosexual ideas, homosexual tolerance within society. Now, 1969, I think 68 or 69, there was the famous Stonewall riots. Now, these were much less than they have been made out to be, but never mind. What happened was that the police at that time in New York were in the habit of busting pubs that were meeting places for homosexuals and transsexuals. They did this, there was a riot, you know. This sparked a far stronger militancy within the gay movement, and it then became much more like the original Mattachine. It became much more left-wing and much more campaigning, much more strident. They became unafraid to tackle politicians and people they didn't like directly, you know, in the streets and in public. Okay? But they retained this idea of accommodationism. So this was really a conservative idea that, you know, we'll blend into society by looking like other guys and nobody will know. That's a problem, because we've just said, and you've seen in the works of Quentin Crisp, that the way he identified a gay man was because he was feminine. You know, that's what a gay man is, feminine. He has female sexuality. So even if he tries to deny this, he's going to want to express himself in more feminine ways, because he desires men. He wants to be penetrated by a man. He likes dick. So he is sexually a woman. He has a female sexuality. Since sexuality and gender are absolutely linked, such that gender is the manner through which we express our sexuality to others, if you have a female sexuality but you're trying to appear to be masculine, then you will suffer gender dysphoria. Right? That's basic. That's basically what gender dysphoria is. It's a mismatch between gender and sexuality. I mean, yeah, we'll talk about the AGP version some other time because that's more complicated, but actually it's the same when you analyse it. So now we have a big complication. On one hand, we have gay men wanting to appear to be masculine when in fact they are feminine, and other gay men policing their behaviour because now they're part of an identifiable group, the LGBT later. And within this identifiable group of gays, political gays or politicised gays, only certain behaviours are permitted, and feminine behaviours are not tolerated. Okay, so if, for example, in his book, 2003 book, I think it was, The Man Who Would Be Queen, Dr. Mike Bailey discusses this, and he talks about sissyphobia or femmephobia, which is the phobia of gay males against feminine behaviours and appearances. Well, that's just internalised homophobia. That's all it is. It's the same thing. I mean, I've always said that the New Gay Man was founded on homophobia, and it is. It's founded on the hatred of appearing to be feminine. And the problem is, gay men can't help it, right? If you're a transgender gay, that is the ones that appear with the gender non-conforming behaviour at the age of 2, 3, 4, GNC throughout childhood, they're the ones on the scale of etiology with transsexuals. They all have gender dysphoria if they don't transition, all of them. And Juno Dawson, a writer, American writer, who formerly gay and came out, transitioned, I think last year or the year before, she wrote a very interesting piece which exposed all this, which said the fact is that the gay male society is absolutely to the ears with pervasive and powerful gender dysphoria. Okay? But at the same time, it's absolutely rabid, full of internalized homophobia, because they hate the femininity of themselves. So they hate the feminine part of themselves. That's internalized homophobia. That's what it is. Now, when a transsexual, a HSTS, leaving aside, we're not discussing the AGPC, when an HSTS transitions, that disappears. As I said before, sexuality and gender are intimately linked. Don't believe the lie that says they're separate. That's a political lie with no basis in science whatsoever. The simple fact is that sexuality and gender are linked. There's two sides of the same coin. Gender is the way that we express our sexuality to others, to potential partners, but also to everyone else in society, because gender is the primary interface through which we interact with everyone else in our society, everyone else around us, and the culture generally. You cannot dispense with gender. Those people who call themselves gender critical are idiots. They're trying to impose Marxist ideas, once again, Marxist ideas on the real world. Your behaviour is conditioned by your sexuality. That's your gender. And you can't get rid of gender because it's innate to humans. All that's happening here is that some males are born with a female sexuality and some females are born with a male one. Now, so internalized homophobia is very much a part of the new gay man expression of homosexuality, which is dominant in the West, but not elsewhere. Everywhere else in the world that I can see, and I've studied, the older understanding of homosexuality, that which was expressed by Quentin Crisp, is normal. That's what people think of when you talk about homosexuals. People quite rightly say, well, homosexuality didn't exist until the 1960s. Yes, that's true, but only that particular form. Only the new gay man form did not exist. As far as we know, catamites, that is males who wished to be penetrated sexually, existed right from the beginning of writing. And obviously, from far before that, they're found all over the world. And most of the world still has exactly the same attitude, which is that homosexual males are those who accept penetration. They want to be penetrated because of female sexuality. That's the nature of the homosexual male. The fact that for political reasons other ideas were adopted in the 1960s, that doesn't mean a thing. We're talking about underlying nature here. And underlying nature is not something that you can challenge in that way. Part of the problem here is that a great deal of new gay man ideology comes straight from Marx, sometimes filtered through the nonsense of postmodernism, but essentially you have to remember that Marx did not believe in genetics. Marx did not believe that genes existed. Marx did not believe that anything in human behaviour was predicated by nature at all. He believed that it was all to do with social conditioning. And yes, you have heard this before. You've heard it from the mouths of feminists and gay activists, and it's just as much of a lie as it was when Marx cooked it up. People are not a blank slate. We are the product of our genes. We're the product of what happens to us in the womb. Most of what we do, we don't decide to do. It's decided for us. Now, that's not to say that you cannot influence your nature or better yourself, but to suggest that humans are simply blank sheets of paper or blank slates is a nonsense. It's just a nonsense. And it's been debunked till it absolutely stinks, but it still keeps coming up because it's politically correct. It's not politically correct to say, well, you know, that person is different from the other person by nature. The problem, or one problem with this notion, is that for gays, homosexual males, even the new gay man, has for decades now insisted that being homosexual is innate. They don't choose to be this way, they just are this way. And they'll ask things like, when did you choose to be heterosexual? It's a perfectly fair point. I mean, that is a reasonable, accurate representation of what homosexuality is like. Sorry, I've lost the crown, by the way, so I'm lisping a bit. Probably sound more gay than usual. That is a reasonable question to ask. What is not reasonable is to say, on one hand, that, oh no, people are blank slates, and on the other hand, but sexuality is innate. Can't be both ways. And so that leads you into the nonsense of sexuality and gender are not related to each other. It's utter pish. It's just utter nonsense. It's a blatant lie, a convenient, politically correct lie, and we should get rid of it as soon as possible, because it harms an awful lot of people. It really does. So to go back to the internalized homophobia, which, Mike Bailey discussed this. He described it as sissyphobia in his 2003 book, The Man Who Would Be Queen. He described it as sissyphobia or feminophobia, but it's actually homophobia. It's the hatred of that which makes a gay man gay, and that is his femininity. Okay? That's all it is. So what he was actually talking about was homophobia, which is both internalized, that is, the gay man who feels ashamed of his own feminine behaviours, but it's also externalized. It's the community of gay men, which the NGM is, New Gay Man is, who suppress those behaviours on the part of the members, who police it, who ostracise gays who are too flamboyant. Don't behave like that. Don't be feminine. Don't be feminine. Be anything you like, but don't be feminine. Now, you have to remember that transgender homosexuals, that is, like say, those who appeared as kids, non-conforming kids, they will grow up to be what I call transgender homosexuals. That is, feminine gay males or masculine gay females, masculine lesbians. And these are etiologies, that is, scales of development. Okay? So they go from, quite naturally, from almost gender conforming, maybe just some slight hints in comportment or voice or manner of homosexuality, right through to full transsexuals. And remember, the only true transsexuals are HSTS. AGPs are pseudo-transsexual. They're not really transsexual at all. That's a pretty broad scale. And where an individual will present on that is conditioned by many, many factors, such as, obviously, the extent of their gender dysphoria. That's the feeling of discomfort at having to present in a gender which does not match their sexuality. Their fear of social retribution at being too feminine, and this, as I've just explained, this can come in the modern world, in the modern West, just as much from great gay society as from straight society. Gays are very, very harsh and intolerant of feminine gays. It can be to do with the way you look, because if you don't pass, life gets a lot more difficult if you're transsexual, and so on and so on. There's a whole bunch of different factors. Things like peer pressure, as discussed, but also loyalty to family, loyalty to social group, desire to not offend those that you love, that sort of thing. And remember, most transgender homosexuals are extremely caring, sweet people. They're not naturally waspish and horrible. It's being forced to suppress themselves that makes them that way, if they are. And there's plenty of examples of those. So what we're talking about here is a situation where a person will transition when the dysphoric pressure exceeds the fear of social intolerance, right? And that could be, depending on the culture you live in, that could be quite a wide range on our scale of etiology. The point here, or what we should read in from all of this, is that, in fact, when a transgender homosexual of either sex transitions, he or she gets rid of their internalized homophobia because they embrace fully their cross-sex status, the cross-sex nature of their sexuality. Right? In other words, a transgender homosexual male embraces fully the fact that actually he's a girl, right? And the opposite is the case, although much more rarely in females, that the so-called trans man, that this person embraces the fact he's a man and not a lesbian. Now, I'm going to come back to that because there are big differences between male HSTS and female HSTS, not least because from birth a male can be either male, that is penetrating, or female, that is receptive in sex. Girls can't do that. So it's a bit different. But that's on perhaps a more metaphysical, psychological, Jungian level, and we'll discuss that in a different video in those terms. So when people like a certain somewhat ignorant professional that is known to these parts, accuse homosexual transsexuals of internalized homophobia by rejecting masculinity, they've got it entirely backwards. They've completely got it the wrong way around. The people who are exhibiting internalized homophobia are actually the gender conforming ones, because they're rejecting their natural femininity. And I think this comes from a misunderstanding that relates gender to sex, when in fact gender is related to sexuality, as we've already seen. I mean, you can be either male or female, and that broadly, normally will mean that you're either masculine or feminine, but for some people that's not the case. Gender is not related to sex directly, it's directly related to sexuality. If you have female sexuality, then you want to have feminine gender. And that's as simple as it is. There's no way around that one. You can't escape it. And the same is true in females. So it's not about denying biology, it's about accepting reality and accepting that your sex is only a small part of your sexuality, because your sexuality is mainly about desire. Yeah, I know. Your sexuality is interesting. Your sex is interesting to sexuality because, after all, if you're a guy, it's the penis that gives you pleasure. But what's most important in sexuality is who you want to have sex with, and how you want to have that sex. And if you're a young male who desires men and who wants to be penetrated, then you've got female sexuality. And it is appropriate, therefore, for you to have feminine gender. These people are not expressing internalized homophobia in any way whatsoever. They're simply embracing what they really are. The ones who are expressing sometimes extreme internalized homophobia are the ones who don't transition.